Welcome to our channel. We're so glad you're here. In today's story, we'll witness an unforgettable moment of true strength, discipline, and respect. But before we dive in, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know. Your thoughts mean a lot to us. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss tomorrow's special story. We have a lot more incredible tales lined up for you. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this powerful lesson in honor and resilience. The moment a royal guard's silence exposed a bully's weakness, Sergeant Mark Daniels stood unwavering at his post in front of the Tower of London, his tall frame steady and unmoving, as a symbol of discipline and old tradition. It was a sunny afternoon, and the crowds were gathered in front of the palace gates, snapping photos and admiring the historic architecture. Mark, dressed in his bright red tunic and famous black bearskin hat, was a part of the living history that drew tourists from all over the world. He was used to the curious glances, the whispers, and the occasional attempt at humor from the onlookers. But today was different. Mark's focus remained fixed ahead, his face a mask of composure. The air was filled with the murmur of conversations, the soft clicking of cameras, and the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby group of tourists. He had perfected the art of standing still, of becoming the embodiment of stoic resolve. Every shift in his posture, every inch of his uniform, was a reflection of the centuries of tradition he had sworn to uphold. But beneath his calm exterior, Mark was constantly aware of every movement, every shift in the crowd around him, every person who approached him with the hope of testing his patience. And today, it seemed, someone had come to do just that. John Harris, a tall man in his mid-30s, pushed through the crowd with broad shoulders and a swagger that spoke of confidence, even arrogance. His steps were heavy, deliberate, as if he were used to having his way. As he neared Mark's post, his eyes locked onto the royal guard's unflinching form, and a sneer curled on his lips. He had seen guards like this before, silent, stoic, almost lifeless. It seemed to John that they were simply part of the scenery, mere statues who would never react, never speak, never break their composed stances. "Well, would you look at this?" John called out, his voice sharp and mocking. "What's the matter, big guy? Are you too scared to speak to me?" His words rang out, cutting through the peaceful atmosphere like a knife, dripping with contempt. The tourists nearby shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension building in the air. Parents pulled their children closer, while others exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how this would play out. But Mark, unmoved, kept his gaze straight ahead, his expression unchanged. His body remained as firm as ever, and his silence was deafening. To him, this was simply another test of his discipline. He had faced far worse in his years of service, and this would be no different. John took a few more steps forward, clearly emboldened by the lack of response. "Oh, I see how it is," he continued, his voice growing louder. "You think you're better than the rest of us, hiding behind that uniform, pretending to be something special. You're nothing but a puppet, statue in a funny hat." Mark didn't blink. His posture didn't change. The crowd was still hanging on to every word. Some recorded the moment on their phones, eager to capture the drama, while others seemed unsure of whether they should step in. John, meanwhile, was growing bolder, his words becoming more venomous. "What are you even protecting?" John shouted, spreading his arms wide as if performing for an audience. "Nothing. You're just here for show, aren't you? Standing around looking pretty for the tourists." But still, Mark stood silent. His discipline was unwavering, his gaze fixed ahead. His stillness was not weakness, it was a display of strength. He wasn't there to entertain, nor was he there to prove anything. He was there to honor a long tradition, to protect something, far greater than any taunt or mockery could diminish. John, however, wasn't done. He leaned in close, so close that Mark could feel the heat of his breath on his face. "What's the matter, soldier boy? Can't handle the truth?" John's voice was low, mocking, dripping with a challenge. At this moment, the tension in the square was palpable. The crowd had grown quiet, their attention focused entirely on the unfolding exchange. Some whispered nervously, wondering when this would escalate. But Mark, the royal guard, remained as steady as ever. It seemed as though John's anger grew in direct proportion to Mark's unyielding silence. Each word, each jab only fueled the rough man's need for a reaction. He began pacing in front of Mark, his voice rising, his movements becoming more erratic. "You think you're something special?" John shouted. "I see through you. You're just a man in a silly uniform, a coward hiding behind a statue." The crowd shifted again, the unease growing. Some of the tourists tried to intervene, speaking out in defense of the royal guard. "Leave him alone," one woman called out. "What's your problem?" Another murmured in disapproval, but John ignored them all, his focus entirely on Mark. With one final taunting gesture, John jabbed his finger into Mark's shoulder. The crowd gasped in shock, some stepping back, others holding their breath. This was the breaking point. Surely Mark would react now. But Mark didn't move. His stillness, his silence was a testament to something far more powerful than words. It was discipline, it was resolve, it was the quiet strength that comes from a life of service and dedication. John laughed again, louder this time, as if to mock the idea that anyone would consider Mark a hero. But it was Mark's unwavering silence that made him a hero. For in that moment, the royal guard's lack of reaction became his greatest strength. It wasn't about what John could provoke. It was about what Mark chose to protect. Honor, tradition, and duty. The tension in the air was thick, palpable. John Harris, the rough man with a sharp, mocking tone, wasn't backing down. His insults seemed to grow sharper with every word, and as he moved closer to Sergeant Mark Daniels, the crowd began to feel the weight of the moment. People who had been casually observing now stood on edge, their eyes darting between the two men, sensing that this was no longer just a playful exchange. John had crossed a line, and it was clear to everyone around that the situation was reaching a boiling point. John's movements were erratic as he paced back and forth in front of the royal guard. His voice, once filled with contempt, now dripped with venom as he continued to taunt Mark. "What's the matter with you, soldier?" John sneered. "Too scared to even move? Too afraid to show your face?" His words were loud, meant for the crowd, as much as they were for Mark, his taunts designed to break the guard's composure. "Is this what you do all day? Stand around pretending to be something you're not? You're nothing but a joke, a puppet in a silly hat." The crowd stirred uneasily, the atmosphere charged with the tension of the confrontation. Some of the tourists looked nervously at each other, unsure if anyone should step in. Others pulled their children closer, not wanting them to witness the escalating aggression. Yet despite the growing hostility, Sergeant Mark Daniels remained a picture of calm, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his body as rigid and unmoving as a statue. John was relentless. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over Mark's motionless form. "You think you're above me?" John shouted, his face now just inches from the guards. "You think you're better than all of us because you wear that uniform?" The anger in his voice was unmistakable, but Mark's gaze never wavered. It was as if the world around him no longer existed, the words, the insults, all fading into the background of his unwavering focus. A few people in the crowd began to protest softly, urging John to stop. "Leave him alone," one woman said, her voice trembling. "What's your problem?" But John was beyond reason, his frustration mounting with every second that Mark refused to react. He jabbed his finger into the guard's shoulder again, his sneer widening. "What's wrong, huh? Too scared to do anything? I'm just a man, just like you." Still, Mark didn't budge. His eyes remained fixed ahead, his posture unyielding. The silence was deafening, broken only by John's harsh laughter. He stepped back, gesturing broadly at the crowd, as if inviting them to join in his mockery. "This is your hero, folks," John bellowed. "A man who doesn't even have the guts to defend himself." The crowd stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The insults grew louder, harsher, as John's taunts reached a fever pitch. He leaned in closer, his voice dripping with disdain. You're just a coward, hiding behind that uniform. You're nothing. You think you're special, but you're just a statue in a hat. Mark's silence was like a wall, unmovable and impenetrable. It was exactly what John had hoped would break, the guard's stoicism, his discipline. But as the seconds ticked by, it became clear to everyone watching that Mark was not going to give in. His calm, his resolve, became the very thing that humiliated John. Every word that John spoke, every taunt that he delivered, only seemed to highlight his own insecurity, his desperation for a reaction. John took another step forward, his frustration boiling over. His hands balled into fists, and with a mocking, sneering laugh, he shouted, "Come on, soldier boy. Show me what you've got. Let's see if you're more than just a puppet for the tourists." And that's when something shifted. Mark, who had remained a solid, unwavering figure, broke his silence in a way no one expected. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of authority, cutting through John's mocking tirade like a knife. "That's enough." John's smirk faltered for a split second. He had expected anger, resistance, perhaps even a verbal confrontation. But what he got was something far more powerful: quiet, controlled authority. Mark's words were like a calm storm, the kind that gathered before the thunder. For a moment, John didn't know how to respond. The crowd, sensing the shift, fell silent. All eyes were on Mark, who remained still, his posture unbroken, as if the world was merely an audience to his unwavering discipline. But John, now taken aback, wasn't done. He stepped back, his chest puffed out, trying to recover his bravado. "What? You think you can intimidate me with a few words?" he scoffed, but there was a slight falter in his voice. His bravado, his swagger began to crumble in the face of Mark's unyielding presence. The tension in the square was unbearable. The silence stretched thin as Mark stood his ground. The tourists, now fully aware of the confrontation, stood in awe of the Royal Guard's calm. They could feel it, the unwavering discipline, the strength of character that flowed from him. It was clear to everyone that Mark was more than just a man in a uniform. He was a living testament to duty, honor, and strength. John's arrogance, his mocking laughter, now sounded hollow in the wake of Mark's silent authority. The once confident man now seemed out of place, as though the very fabric of his bravado had unraveled before the stillness of the guard. The audience, once unsure of what would happen next, now felt the weight of the lesson unfolding before them. Mark's composure had turned the tables. In his silence, in his discipline, he had taught John a lesson that words alone could never deliver. True strength was not about shouting the loudest, about bullying those who couldn't fight back. It was about standing firm, about being unshaken in the face of ridicule and challenge. Mark wasn't just protecting himself, he was protecting the ideals that had been entrusted to him. Ideals that John could never understand, no matter how loud he yelled. As the confrontation reached its boiling point, the crowd's unease became palpable. Every eye was locked on the scene unfolding before them. John Harris, the rough man whose mocking laughter had filled the air, was now clearly frustrated. His earlier bravado had begun to falter as Sergeant Mark Daniels remained unwavering, his disciplined silence a stark contrast to John's growing anger. Mark's stillness wasn't just a passive resistance. It was a deliberate show of strength, a controlled power that only made John more desperate to break him. John stepped forward again, his fists clenched in frustration. He jabbed a finger into Mark's shoulder, his voice rising in a final venomous challenge. "What's the matter, soldier? You think you're better than me? You think you're untouchable just because you stand there in that stupid uniform?" His words were loud now, carrying across the square, drawing more attention from the crowd. The tourists stood frozen, some clutching their phones ready to capture every moment, while others whispered anxiously to one another. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm waiting to break. Yet Mark, the Royal Guard, remained unmoved. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, his body as firm and resolute as ever. The rough man's taunts only seemed to fuel his stillness, and that silence, in turn, seemed to deepen John's frustration. "You think you're some kind of hero, huh?" John spat, his voice dripping with mockery. He paced back and forth in front of the guard, his movements more erratic now, as though he were a caged animal. "Look at you, standing there like a stone statue. I see through you. You're nothing. More than a puppet. A decoration for the tourist to gawk at." The words were sharp, biting, each one designed to provoke a reaction. But Mark, unmoving and silent, did not give him that satisfaction. The longer he stayed silent, the more John's words seemed to lose their power. It wasn't just that the guard wasn't reacting. It was that he was unshaken, impervious to John's insults. Mark's stoic demeanor became a symbol of something greater than just an unmoving soldier. It represented something timeless, the strength to endure, the ability to stand firm in the face of relentless pressure. To John, it was infuriating. To the crowd, it was awe-inspiring, but John couldn't see it. His insults grew louder, his voice more desperate as he leaned in closer. Just inches from Mark's face. "You're nothing," he shouted, his breath hot and foul. "You're a coward. I could walk all over you and you wouldn't do a damn thing." The crowd held its breath. No one knew how far John would go, how much longer this confrontation would last. Some people began to whisper, unsure if anyone should intervene. Others were paralyzed by the sheer intensity of the scene, their eyes darting between John and the unbroken royal guard. Mark's gaze never wavered, his body never shifted. He remained like a pillar of stone, unbothered by the chaos swirling around him. His silence became louder than any word he could have said. Every mocking word, every insult, every challenge seemed to bounce off him like water off a rock. Finally, John made one last attempt to provoke the royal guard. He took a step back, then charged forward, his hand raised in a mocking gesture. He shoved Mark's shoulder with all his strength, the push strong enough to make the guard's body shift slightly. The crowd gasped, and some people stepped forward, murmuring in concern. But Mark, as if the shove had never happened, did not move. His posture remained impeccable, his expression still and unreadable. John, seething with frustration, stepped back again. His hands were balled into fists, and his face was flushed with anger. He shouted at the crowd, "Look at this! This is your hero, standing there like a statue. He won't even fight back. What kind of man does that? What kind of soldier does that?" The crowd was silent now, their discomfort growing. Some of them shifted uneasily, glancing around, waiting for someone to intervene. But no one moved. They were all too captivated by the display of self-control before them. Mark's silence spoke louder than any confrontation could have. It was a silent challenge to everything John had believed about strength. The rough man, now losing his composure, looked around at the crowd, hoping to regain some sense of power. But all he saw was the steady gaze of the royal guard, whose quiet resolve had somehow shifted the dynamics of the confrontation entirely. The crowd's gaze had shifted too. It was no longer about John's taunts. It was about Mark's unflinching silence and the strength it represented. John took a deep breath, his arrogance starting to crumble. He had expected to break the guard, to provoke him into a reaction that would make him the center of attention. But now he stood there, unsure of what to do next. His earlier confidence had turned into insecurity, his mockery replaced by a bitter realization. Mark had won, not with words but with an unshakable presence. His silence had been the greatest weapon of all. The crowd, still in awe of the royal guard's strength, began to murmur amongst themselves. The once aggressive man now looked out of place, his bravado stripped away, his power over the situation lost. Mark stood tall and silent, a quiet symbol of discipline and honor, while John's earlier confidence seemed to evaporate into the thickening air of defeat. As John Harris continued to taunt and mock Sergeant Mark Daniels, the tension in the air reached a breaking point. The rough man's anger had only grown with every passing moment. His mocking laughter echoed through the square, but Mark remained an immovable wall of silence. Each insult only seemed to fuel John's frustration more, and the crowd stood frozen, unsure of what would happen next. Would the guard finally react? Would John's taunts break his composure? But as the crowd braced for what seemed like an inevitable escalation, something unexpected happened. The harsh laughter of John Harris was cut short by a calm, firm voice. from the back of the crowd. "That's enough," the voice rang out, steady and unyielding, like a grounding force cutting through the chaos. The voice came from an older man, whose silver hair caught the sunlight, a faint aura of wisdom surrounding him despite his unassuming appearance. John turned sharply, momentarily thrown off guard by this unexpected interruption. The older man, not tall nor imposing, stepped forward from the crowd with a quiet authority that commanded attention. He stood in front of John, his posture straight, his eyes unwavering, his voice calm but resolute. "You're making a fool of yourself," he said, his gaze locked on John. "Leave the man alone." John, caught between his anger and the sudden shift in the air, let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Oh, great. Now we have Grandpa coming to the rescue," he sneered, turning to the crowd with an exaggerated shrug, as if expecting them to share in his amusement. "What's next? A marching band?" His words dripped with sarcasm, but the older man didn't flinch. He didn't react to the taunts, his focus entirely on the rough man before him. "You don't know the first thing about what it takes to stand there," the older man continued, his voice firm yet unruffled. "The discipline, the training, the responsibility. You see a man in a uniform, but you don't see the sacrifice behind it." John's face darkened, and his bravado faltered for a moment. He took a step closer to the older man, his voice low and threatening. "Who do you think you are?" he growled, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think you're better than me because you've got a big mouth and fancy words?" The older man stood his ground, unwavering. His calm demeanor was like an anchor in the storm, his eyes never leaving John's face. "I know what it means to serve, to protect, and to respect those who do," he said quietly. "That's something you clearly don't understand." The crowd, which had been anxiously watching the confrontation, began to shift. A few murmured in agreement with the older man's words, while others exchanged hesitant glances, unsure if they should intervene. But the message was clear. The older man's calm words carried more weight than John's taunts. The rough man's arrogance had begun to waver, his earlier confidence slipping away as the older man stood resolutely before him. John, however, wasn't done. His face twisted with anger, and he stepped even closer to the older man, his towering frame casting a shadow over the smaller figure before him. "You think you're tough, old man?" he snarled. "Maybe you need to be taught a lesson about minding your own business." The older man's gaze remained steady, his voice quiet but full of authority. "Violence doesn't make you strong," he said calmly. "It only makes you weak." For a moment, John hesitated. The words hung in the air, and for the first time, doubt flickered across his face. But his frustration quickly overtook him, and he stepped even closer, his fists clenched, ready to lash out. "Weak, huh?" he spat. "I'll show you weak." But before he could take another step, something incredible happened. Cutting through the tension like a knife, Sergeant Mark Daniels, who had remained silent and still through it all, stepped forward. With a swift, precise movement, he placed himself between John and the older man, his stance as firm and unyielding as ever. John froze, his arrogance faltering. He had been so focused on breaking the guard's composure that he hadn't seen it coming. Mark, the royal guard, had finally moved. But there was no anger in his movement, no aggression. Just calm, deliberate action. A controlled strength that instantly shifted the power dynamic. Mark's hand shot out to intercept John's raised fist, stopping it in midair with the strength of iron. The crowd gasped in unison. No one had expected the guard to finally break his silence, but when he did, it was with the precision of someone who had endured far worse than this. John, stunned by the guard's unyielding grip, struggled briefly, his bravado completely gone. His earlier confidence had vanished, replaced by panic and frustration. The guard, Mark Daniels, said nothing. His grip tightened slightly, his calm voice cutting through the chaos. "That is enough," he said, his tone low but firm, filled with authority. John's resistance crumbled as quickly as it had come. The power had shifted. The guard, who had once been nothing more than a silent figure to John, was now standing between him and the crowd, his presence undeniable. For the first time, John realized the power of silence, the strength that came not from shouting, but from remaining firm in the face of provocation. The crowd, once tense and uncertain, now stood in awe of the guard's quiet authority. John, humiliated and defeated, was left struggling in Mark's unrelenting grip. There was no more bravado, no more arrogance, just the cold, hard reality of his own weakness in the face of true strength. The air in the square was thick with tension, as the rough man, now trapped by Sergeant Mark Daniels's unyielding grip, struggled against the firm hold. His face was flushed with frustration, his earlier bravado shattered as he realized he was no longer in control. For the first time in the confrontation, it was clear to everyone watching that the Royal Guard had turned the tables. The crowd, who had been uncertain and hesitant moments ago, now stood in silent awe of the Guard's quiet authority. John Harris, the man who had tried to provoke a reaction, now found himself powerless. He yanked his arm, but Mark's grip remained unbroken. The more John fought, the more he realized that he was only making himself look weaker, more desperate. The Guard's strength was not in his words or in physical force alone. It was in his calm, his discipline, and his absolute refusal to be provoked. "Let me go," John spat, his voice cracking as he struggled in vain. His once confident tone was now laced with panic, the realization that he had crossed a line settling in. His earlier insults, his mocking jabs, all seemed so distant now, like a different person had been speaking. In front of the crowd, with his arm firmly held by Mark, John was exposed, stripped of the bravado that had fueled him for so long. The Royal Guard, Sergeant Mark Daniels, did not flinch. His face remained stoic, unshaken by John's pleas or his increasingly panicked efforts to escape. Mark's presence was like a silent storm, calm but unyielding. He did not need to shout, to raise his voice, or to retaliate. His silence, his stillness, was all the power he needed, and it was enough. "You've crossed the line." Mark's voice cut through the silence like a blade. His words were measured, calm, and controlled, but they carried the weight of years of service, of duty, and of honor. The rough man's struggles weakened as the realization sank in. He was no longer in control. John stopped fighting for a moment, his chest heaving with heavy breaths, his eyes darting around, looking for someone, anyone, who might intervene. But the crowd wasn't on his side. Some of the people who had initially recorded his taunts now stood in quiet disapproval, their phones lowered. The few who had tried to stand back and avoid the situation were now visibly shaken by the intensity of the moment, and the whispers began to rise, soft at first but then growing louder as the crowd began to admire the Royal Guard's unyielding stance. "You're making a fool of yourself," the older man, who had stepped in earlier, said again, his voice still calm but filled with the quiet authority that had drawn everyone's attention. The crowd began to murmur in agreement. There was something about the older man's words that cut through the tension, that highlighted the difference between John's aggression and the calm strength of the Guard. Sergeant Daniels, still holding John in place, glanced briefly at the older man, then refocused on the rough man before him. The shift in power was complete. The crowd now understood. This wasn't just about a confrontation between a guard and a rude tourist. This was a reminder of the strength in discipline, in holding your ground and the power of restraint. "Do you think you're better than me?" John sneered, his words weaker now, barely above a whisper. But there was no answer from Mark. He didn't need to say anything. The silence spoke louder than anything he could have said. And as the rough man's anger began to wane, the reality of his situation became clear. Mark's grip remained firm as the officers from the palace arrived on the scene, their presence signaling the end of the confrontation. They moved quickly but respectfully, addressing the situation with the calm that Mark had displayed. "We'll take it from here," one of the officers said, his voice steady. John, now fully aware of his defeat, was led away by the officers. His earlier defiance had crumbled completely, replaced by frustration and humiliation. He tried to argue, to regain some semblance of control, but his voice was weak, and no one was listening. The crowd, once anxious and divided, now stood in quiet respect for the royal guard, who had quietly, resolutely, protected the older man and upheld his duty. Sergeant Daniels returned to his post, his composure unbroken. His uniform, slightly askew from the confrontation, was quickly straightened. But even with his hat slightly askew, his presence remained commanding. He stood tall and firm, embodying the very essence of discipline and honor. The crowd, still gathered, now looked at him with admiration, their earlier whispers replaced by quiet nods of approval. The royal guard had won, not through physical force, but through silence, dignity, and unshakable resolve. The older man, who had played a crucial role in diffusing the situation, turned to Mark with a grateful nod. "Thank you," he said softly. Mark didn't respond. He simply nodded once, acknowledging the moment, then turned back to face the crowd, his eyes fixed ahead. It was over. The rough man was gone. The square slowly returned to normal, but the lesson was clear to everyone who had witnessed the scene. True strength isn't about force or intimidation. It's about standing firm in your values, no matter how much the world tries to provoke. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's powerful story. What do you think about the Royal Guard's reaction in this tense confrontation? Do you believe that true strength lies in silence and restraint? Or is it about speaking up and defending yourself? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to hold your ground, despite being provoked? How did you react, and what did you learn from the experience? This story isn't just about a guard at the Tower of London. It's about the power of discipline, respect, and the lessons we can learn from those who choose not to engage in aggression, but instead remain calm and composed. We want to know, how do you define strength? Is it physical, emotional, or something deeper? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about what it truly means to stand firm in the face of adversity. And don't forget to like this video if it resonated with you. Share it with friends who would appreciate the lesson, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, honor, and resilience. We have more inspiring content coming your way soon. Stay tuned.